Hello, and welcome to another virtual author chat at the Poison Pen Bookstore. I'm John Charles, and today the Poison Pen is delighted to have with us author Desi Mesa, whose new book is Bindle Punk Bruja. Before we begin, I would like to let those listening in know that they can obtain one copy or more if they'd like from the Poison Pen of Desi's new book. Simply give us a call or go online, and we would be happy to connect you with this truly wonderful, it's a debut novel, isn't it?
It is, yes.
And now I'd like to welcome Desi.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm real excited
Thank
for all of
you.
this. So
Oh,
appreciate the opportunity.
thank you for being here. I'm always fascinated by authors, especially how they got to where they're at, but who they were before they decided to become an author. And you have kind of an interesting background. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself before your journey to publication?
Yeah, well, there's probably a lot to my background, but I originally, for so many years since I was a teenager, I was actually writing poetry and songs and didn't even really realize that writing was something that I could do until I decided to go to college for the first time. I was about 34 when I
Oh,
went to one semester of college. I did well, but I'd gone to that one. And my English class that I took, there was just the 101. I began to research some things about Kansas City for a paper, and I just fell in love with learning the craft of writing.
oh.
And since then, kind of did a lot of self-teaching. But yeah, I don't know which part of the background you're asking about because there is a lot to
There is
it,
a lot.
but
If I'm understanding correctly and hearing correctly, you really didn't intentionally start out to be an author. That was
didn't.
kind of,
No, I actually dropped out of high school twice. I did not graduate. I moved on to getting married, having children, just working from home, doing daycares, and um, always loved just expressing myself through writing. And like I said, when I went to that college class, I'm like, maybe I really like this. And there's been a story in my head since I was a teenager. I don't know if I know that there are writers that do this, but I would hear a song and I would just play scenes over and over and over in my head. And I saw it as kind of a movie. And when I was about 35, just wanted to write it down and see what happened. And it just really took off from there.
and that's Bindle Punk Bruja. That became
Well,
your,
that was actually a sci-fi series. It was
oh,
too big to be really a debut. I still have it and I want to do something with it, but Bindle Punk Bruja was born out of after I got that other story out of my head. I really wanted to write something that was maybe a little more meaningful. The other one's more like action, and that kind of thing. But this one was more personal to me.
oh. What can you tell us about Bindle Punk Bruja?
Well, it is a journey of a daughter of an immigrant in 1925. She is white passing. Her father is a white lawyer who does not acknowledge her, and her mother came to this country. I used a lot of my own family's, what I understand our history and how we got here from my grandparents. My great grandmother had this tale of getting here, and jumping on a train and barely making it while holding on to her baby, which was my grandfather.
Mm.
There's just little pieces hinted in there at that, but I took it at the place of Luna, where she was born here, and really feels like she doesn't know where she belongs, whether it's in the Mexican boxcar community or, being white passing. Should she forge her own path with having opportunities her family doesn't have, and really researching my family's journey and Kansas City in that era it was just a perfect setting for all of that. And I had to use magic because,
Mhm.
it's fantasy and I love fantasy. So I wanted to pick a Mexican folklore style story to kind of weave into that as inspiration.
Your heroine really does live in two worlds. It's Rose and Luna, is that correct?
Yeah, her name is Luna Alvarado. And she adopts the name Rose. Well, her mother actually gave it to her, Rose Lane, so she could live in the world with, as a white passing woman, just gave her so many more opportunities. At least how her mother felt that would be best path for her as a girl. And that's the life we drop into in the first chapter. She is an adult and kind of living that out, but still feels whitewashed and lost herself somehow.
I thought you really did such a brilliant job with the historical setting, the 1920s. because it was a period of so much change in America and in Kansas and other places too. Women were gradually kind of getting more rights, not equal rights, but more rights than they had before. And you see that in Rose and Luna's relationship as a reporter with one of her fellow reporters, and how they're trying to prove that they deserve the same respect, same kind of job consideration as their male counterparts. You see it in how she interacts with the men that supply her speakeasy nightclub. It's it's not just the fact that she's facing challenges because of who she is ethnically, it's also because of who she is as a woman.
Absolutely. That research was probably some of the most fascinating to me because there, when you get into it in the 20s and, especially in middle America, USA, you've got like just these very conservative ideals at the time. And what shocked me was how much different things actually weren't from the narrative we're still talking about today, where the battles that we're still fighting today for women's rights. But you look back, there are heroes, heroines all over the 20s who were saying the same things that we're saying today. We just want to be on a level playing field. So, and same with the LGBTQ community. There's an entire underground that I wish I could have really gotten into. The book would have been much bigger. Of course, we've got a sequel we're putting together, so hopefully we can get into more of that. But yeah, it was absolutely fascinating to see where we come from, how far we have come. I want to give props to those that have blazed a trail. We've come very far, but we have a lot of work to do still.
Mhm. What you also did really effectively was, it's not just the time period, but you bring it to life. There was like a lot of slang terms and things like that that people use, and real historical figures like Al Capone, and the music and things like that. What kinds of sources did you use for your historical research?
It actually started out with my college class. The paper that I originally wrote was we had to do research on something from Kansas City in the past. So I chose, early 1900s. George Kessler, who in many major cities in America, if not most of them, was designing the parks and boulevards. And so my paper was about that. It doesn't sound exciting, but what I got into is when you redesign an entire city, you kind of have to move out and displace the undesirables. And that's where I took it. And that's where kind of the pieces started for Bindle Punk Bruja.
I found it fascinating, and to be honest, I really didn't know this. Your book focuses on the Kansas City area and how the Mexican immigrants came there. When I think of Mexican immigration, I think of the Southwest, I think of California, I don't think of the Midwest, but there was actually a huge number for that area that came to the Midwest and became part of that community.
Many cities, you look at Midwest cities, you'll find histories of that along the railroad, if there are cities that are along the railroad that were stretching east to west. And they were, living in these boxcars, not because they wanted to. No one wants to stuff, 8 to 10 people into a boxcar. But, at that same time, language barrier, also title restrictions were becoming a huge thing. Thank you, J.C. Nichols, for all of that. And he, in Kansas City, made sure, and in many cities, that whites only, it says it on the title restrictions. You can't buy here, you can't rent here. And so, Hispanic families are just trying to live here that they can. And so the boxcar communities was a very interesting piece of the research.
For those that aren't familiar, can you elaborate a little bit on what the boxcar communities were?
Sure. So cities were hiring Mexican immigrants for cheap labor, obviously, to come up from Mexico. The men would come up first and they would work on the railroads. And to house them for free, they let them live in boxcars that were around the rivers, around the railroads. And eventually they would make enough money to send for their entire families to come up and live. And again, not having really access to housing, they would live in those boxcars. And eventually some cities would put programs together to try to help with the language barriers and education and housing. But at that time it was, send for your family, and everyone's living in these boxcars, trying to fix them up even to make them look kind of like houses. And it was an entire community.
That's fascinating. I also found a reference somewhere about your book in the Guadalupe Center. Can you tell us a little bit about what that was?
Yeah, the Guadalupe Center, and I don't have my notes to see exactly the year, but its whole purpose began to help with, well, actually what the newspapers were calling the Mexican problem.
Uh,
I actually had some here. I was going to do some videos on TikTok later on some of this. And the Mexican problem, as it said in the newspapers, was referencing these families that were stuffed into these boxcars. The children weren't able to really go to school because of language barriers, and they just saw a need to especially upper class white women saw a need. They wanted to go in and help. And while they were well intentioned, when it first started, it was to Americanize these communities rather than help them, keep their culture and develop their own communities. So they would teach English, they would teach them how to make what they called proper American meals, teach children how to play proper American games with other children, and things like that. And eventually the Guadalupe Center was kind of taken by the Mexican community and used to develop their own communities so that they could maintain their culture.
It's fascinating. There's also an element of fantasy in the form of magic in your story. Can you tell those of us who might not be familiar with it a little bit about what Bruja is, what earth magic is?
So Bruja is Spanish for witch, basically. Brujeria is a type of witchcraft that goes way back. I'm not even sure how far back it goes, but it's like Mexican witchcraft. And there are a lot of fascinating things that are different in Brujeria that I've researched than in the kind of witchcraft we typically see from European stories and even old American stories. There's some things I'm going to be weaving into the sequel, especially that are specifically Mexican Brujeria. And I don't want to give too much away on that, but it is I chose an old tale just regarding magic dirt, and it's very simple. I just wanted it to really be symbolic, more or less, of Luna's identity and her, coming into herself and being proud of who she is.
It was very interesting. I could be wrong, and correct me if I am, but it seems like part of Mexican Bruja magic is based on knowledge of botanicals, of herbs, of plants.
Yes. So there's even different groups, I guess, if you will. There are those who believe more of a superstitious side. They're not going to call it magic, because there's also a history of that being evil. And so there's a side where it's just about healing, spiritual healing, physical healing. There are things that they would do, superstitiously for healing purposes. But then there's also another side that I explore with Luna that is capable of a whole bunch of other things. So I kind of wanted to dig into weaving all of it because it's just fascinating to me.
Can you talk a little bit about your writing process? Because you've not only written Bindle, Punk, Bruja, but you've done short stories, you've done poetry. When you're approaching a project, how do you know which format you want to go? Talk about your writing process.
Yeah, sure. Well, like I said, a lot of it is self-taught. So I would research things and I would apply them, research and apply them. But when it really comes creatively for me, I start out by listening to music. It's very inspirational. I'll kind of draw a scene in my head. Now, when it comes to poetry, I don't claim to be I'm not knowledgeable in the art of poetry, and somehow people are responding to what I'm putting together. It is 100% an outlet for me. So on my website and on Twitter, I share a lot of poetry, on Instagram as well. And the short stories I have on there are also just for expressive purposes, but I really enjoy immersive writing. So, that's, if I were to describe my writing in any way, I want to immerse you into a setting, into a person's journey, into a feeling even that you carry with you and hopefully stays with you for a while.
I think you succeeded with the book. You do build that world. It's very rich. It's very evocative.
Thank you.
I would say that, I'm not sure, but I would think that from your work as a poet, that can influence your work as a novelist, because I see you making word choices that are very careful. You want things to sound a certain way as a novelist.
I do. I do. Voice has been number one uh, thing to me. The narrator themselves are almost always the main character for me. I like that first person as close as you can get. Um, uh, Limited um, narrator. Just basically just get as close and the head of a person as you can get so you can walk right in their world. And in 1925, when you were talking about the language that they were using, the slang and all of it, I wanted to bring things that we typically didn't see in the movies we've seen, in the books we've seen in the past, really explore that underbelly, that underground side of the 1920s. It's not Gatsby,
Mhm.
it's not glittering as much. There's a lot more stories to be
Darker.
told there.
What was it like getting the book published? Because you had this idea, you wrote the book. Um, you're not, as you said, well versed in the field of writing and authorship. Was it purely by luck? Did something happen?
Well, when I wrote the sci-fi series, I had to get that story out of my head.
Mhm.
It's been in my head since I was playing with Barbies, and I'm like, okay, I've got this story, I gotta get it out. And I wrote it down with the intention that I was going to get published. And I will tell you, at that time, I had no idea what that meant, what that was going to take. I didn't know that I was going to have to query for an agent. I didn't even know what that meant at the time I just wrote it. By the time I wrote Bindle Punk Bruja, I understood what the task was. And I also wrote that with the intention that I want to get this published. I write things that others may read them. I know a lot of writers say I write for myself, and I do in some ways, but I share it because I'm wanting other people to also digest it and it affect them as well. So I wanted to get this published. When I first started querying the sci-fi series, I mean, that was a hot mess. Let's face it. Most people's first rounds is like
Mhm.
really tough. Any kind of critique or criticism, I fell apart. Bindle Punk was different. I was ready to, I want to be a professional. I want to do this. So it took, I wrote Bindle Punk in 2 months. That's how passionate I was about that one. Yeah, it's crazy. That's way faster than any of my other projects. Um, it was probably about 6 months by the time I got my agent, and then another 6 months by the time we got the publishing deal with Harper. And it was an absolute dream. I'm hoping I don't wake up from this one, but I will tell you, the pressure of the scrutiny from the industry, you got to be ready for it. You got to be ready to say, I am not a perfect writer. I can make mistakes, or there are ways, not even mistakes, but there are ways to really improve this craft always, and to be ready and willing to do that.
Was it challenging to get Bindle Punk Bruja published because you're not just in one genre. There's elements of historical fiction, there's elements of romance, there's
Mm.
magical realism, I guess you'd say. There's lots of things going on there.
That made the pitching part difficult. So when you're pitching a book, you're thinking about, okay, how do I want to tell this agent or this publisher where this would be on the shelf, And that absolutely was a challenge. I didn't know really what to call it. She really helped me out with it. And Harper found a place for it. I think we're leaning more towards fantasy with all of these other elements in
Mhm.
it, honestly, because which when I first turned it in to the publisher during the editing process, it had far less magic in the beginning. It's like, well, if we're going to go fantasy, we need to go fantasy. So we need to really, amp that up, which I'm happy to do. Anytime a publisher or anyone's like, yeah, we need to add a chapter, I will do that in a heartbeat, because I had to do so much cutting, So for word count, when you're first querying your first book as a debut novelist, you have to stick to these word count, standards to try to get seen, Um, and so it was great when I got my publisher and they're like, we need more. I'm like, yes, more. I'm going to plug in my computer because I didn't realize it was almost dead, but I am
We'll
listening.
give
I'm
you a
so sorry.
second. Well, I think one of the benefits to writing a book that crosses over to so many genres is readers who might not read fantasy but like historical fiction are going to be intrigued by the setting, and readers who might not necessarily gravitate towards historical fiction are going to think, well, there's a romance there at the core of the story, so I can buy into that. So it's
That's my hope.
challenging. Yeah, but I think you also speak to a lot of different readers. Um, if you could, now that you're about to become or have been a published author,
Mhm.
and you could go back in time to when you were first starting out as a writer, what advice would you give yourself?
When I first started out, well, I would say to honestly, to not give up. There were times that I wondered what in the hell I was doing, you know? Like, is this worth taking, I think I took, I want to say 6 months off of work,
Yeah.
maybe even 8. Like, is it really, that's how much I believed when I first started, and I was super ignorant, didn't know what querying was. And I thought I was going to just turn in a manuscript to a publisher and they were going to publish it for me. To definitely hold on to that kind of hope, because it did drive me. um, and to continue to believe in myself, um, you know, as people are liking it, because what I discovered was the more successful this project has become, the more press that we're receiving, the more buzz, the more I have this imposter syndrome growing and growing and growing. So constantly giving myself the same advice is don't give up on yourself, keep working at it. And that's the thing that I've seen a lot with myself in the beginning and with people who are trying to get published today, is getting discouraged when you get those rejections. I see people give up after 2, 3.
Yes. Hmm.
If you count the sci-fi series plus Bindle Punk, I've received over 100 rejections on projects, you know? So
That's, hmm. That's very smart advice, because I have heard other authors who have been rejected like hundreds of times.
yeah,
And sometimes what I don't think, I think aspiring writers don't understand is a rejection is not necessarily saying we hate you and we hate your book. We're just saying it's not right for our publishing house. We don't know how to market this. It's not that the book is bad. It's just, it's not a good match with us. So they're just,
that's absolutely true. And you know what? There's another hard truth in there I had to discover, especially when I was doing that first trilogy, is sometimes it's not ready.
yeah.
Sometimes it's not ready, and there's a redirection in that rejection where you have to look and say, okay, is my opener really capturing people? Are my characters flat, or is the voice really taking someone into this story? So I looked at it each and every time. Every rejection, I would have to analyze that and be okay with maybe it's not ready yet,
Mhm.
and just keep working at it.
In addition to writing yourself, if my research is correct, you're also helping other writers because you're a managing editor at everywritersresource.com. Is that correct?
Yes. Now that project, I have shelved it for a little while. I worked on it for quite some time with a team, and we would seek out, unpublished writers, especially who wanted to write short pieces or poetry. We'd also do article. There are still articles on there to help with learning how to write, learning how to query, how to get published. There's a lot on there that's really helpful for people to take a look at. But because of the
Me-
projects I'm on right now, I've had to kind of step away. But it's a massive website full of really good information for people.
I don't think sometimes aspiring writers understand that today, especially when you're a writer, it's not just about writing the book. Once it's actually published, you have to pretty much market it to yourself. What advice would you give in terms of marketing that you've learned as an author?
Well, I've had a couple different experiences. I will go ahead and say, with Bindle Punk and this particular project, I do have a pretty good team at Harper that has been helping. So I do want to acknowledge that. But I do have to do my own part. So when there are things coming up, when there's announcements, when the book has hit Indie Next lists and all these things, like I still have to share all of that on my platforms and be visible, because people need to know that you're there. There's another project I worked on with Quill and Crow Publishing. They're a small publisher who does short stories. They're getting ready to do novels, and they've published my poetry in particular. I'm referencing, it's kind of like a gothic macabre type of style, and I love it. And I mean, so being with an indie publisher with my poetry, I quickly learned, there's a lot more you've got to do there as well. But everybody's got to do it. You got to share, you got to be comfortable saying, this is what I created and I want you to see it, and not be ashamed to put that out there. I see a lot of writers or authors that will share their project, and it'll just say, hey, I did a thing, and they seem like really kind of shy about it. You did a thing, then tell us about it and be proud of it.
Yeah. It's really hard because a lot of writers are introspective. They're not used to being in front of the spotlight, and you really have to set that aside if you want your work to get noticed.
Yes, you do. You do. You have to be okay and comfortable with speaking about it. I even, myself, as often as I've had to speak about this book so far, and had the opportunity, I should say, if I go out with my friends to a dinner party or something, and someone randomly asks me to talk about my book, I still blank out and I go, I have no idea what it's about. I cannot elevator pitch you right now. I wasn't ready, So it happens to all of us, but yeah.
If we can switch gears a little bit and talk about Desi as a reader, if I understand correctly, like your book, you read a lot of different kinds of things. Can you share some of your favorite books, maybe, with us?
Yeah, and you want to know something? I actually love older classic books.
Oh, good.
So I'll reread them a lot.
Mhm.
I also have to be careful what I'm reading when I'm in the middle of a project. Maybe I'm weird, but that's the way my brain is wired. So I haven't done a lot of it yet. But once I finish turning in my sequel in October, I want to get to my to be read pile. But I love everything literary, the real world grounded things like The Help. I thought was just the most
That was an
fascinating
amazing
book.
book. Yeah.
I loved that book.
Yeah.
To YA, A Gentleman's Guide to Vice and Virtue by
Oh,
Mackenzie Lee. That is such a fun book, and was actually the inspiration for Heck Kessler in my book, and also using first person. I hadn't used first person yet until I read that book. But I love older stuff. Anne of Green Gables is one of my favorite books. The Outsiders. I'll reread those those loves of my teenagehood over and over and over again.
I could be incorrect, but didn't you like quote reference The Outsiders and Bindle Punk Bruja? Or maybe I'm thinking of something else.
Actually, I think I referenced The Great
Oh, The
Gatsby.
Great
There is
Gatsby. That's
also an interview I did. I don't know, maybe if you read it or not online, where I did reference The Outsiders as well. But Gatsby came out the same year that my book takes place.
mhm.
So there might have been a reference in there to that. So, and I also love anthologies. So I've been reading this Brackish Harbor by Quill and Crow. Again, I think the stuff they do, and I can't do horror. Okay. I don't like scary stuff. So their stuff's more like creepy gothic. So
Mhm.
all over the place with my style.
What about social media platforms as an author? Which ones do you participate in?
It's like, which ones do I not? My biggest one is Twitter. That's where I first discovered the writing community and pitch contests and like, what is querying? That's where I first started out. So I've been there for like 3 years. So I've been able to build a pretty good following there and friendships and things. And then Instagram, I'm learning how to use. It's become a lot of fun. I like that, and TikTok, doing the fun videos. But what you'll find about me is I'm also very real. So I'll talk about PTSD, and I'll talk about my real life issues on there too. And when my best friend, he's always making fun of me for what he calls my emo poetry. I'm always like doing sad stuff, but I'm not always sad. I'm just expressing, but
I think
yeah.
I saw.
So I think basically Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram. There is a YouTube page. It has some karaoke on there and some of my poetry readings. So take that for what you want. My Facebook page is a little more active, but gosh, I gotta say, I'm not on there as much.
You did reference a little bit about what's coming next. Can you tell us anything about what we can hope from you?
Yeah, so I'm getting ready to turn in Bindle Punk 2, as we call it. I know what title I want to call it, but we'll powwow and make sure. I know that they like it, but I don't want to give anything away until it's solid. But basically, we're picking up from the story that leaves off in Bindle Punk is in the summer, and the sequel picks up right around the new year, in the winter of turning to 1926. So it's about 6 months later. And it goes deeper and darker, and I do tap into a little bit of what I can handle of my horror side in there.
Hmm. Well, that sounds absolutely fascinating. And do you have a website where authors can learn more about you and your books?
I do. It's desideriamesa.com, just my name. And then you'll see all of my nerding out poetry, short stories, and then stuff on Bindle Punk there as well.
Yeah. Well, I can't believe we've already run past our time allotment. You've just been a fascinating guest.
Thanks.
The Poison Pen has just been truly honored to have with us today author Desi Mesa, whose new book is Bindle, Punk, Bruja. And the good news is there's another one in the works, soon to be appearing, or relatively soon in the near future, on bookshelves everywhere. Thank you, Desi.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
Hello. We hope you're enjoying our programs and podcasts with authors. We'd like to expand them, and your help would be appreciated. Please make a donation at poisonedpenfoundation.org. 100% of the proceeds will go to help connect authors with readers in this difficult time. Thank you.